England, up until this point, if they had no other form of support, went into the workhouse. Okay? The old age pension was designed to enable people to stay out of the workhouse. And most importantly, in 1911, the introduction of a system of social security through a national insurance scheme, where people were insured against loss of earnings after 15 weeks. So if you're unemployed for 15 weeks, you were compensated with a benefit. And that system was paid partly by employers, partly by workers from their wage packet, and partly by the state. By 1914, there are 13 million insured workers. So less than, I'm trying to think of that as a percentage of the workforce, probably about less than half. Nonetheless, it was a significantly radical move, a radical series of legislation to produce a new constitutional crisis. Basically, to cut this story short, because I'm running out of time, the House of Lords, which of course had a conservative majority because it was a hereditary house, refused to pass the People's Budget. It refused to pass the legislation. And eventually, after a couple of elections, what happens is the Liberal Party is re-elected, and they passed the Parliament Act of 1911, which removes the ability of the unelected House of Lords to block any financial measure passed by the elected House of Commons. Okay? Very, very big moment where the political power of the aristocracy is decisively checked, and the so-called popular will of the House of Commons triumphed. The women's suffrage movement. I'm going to do this very quickly because I've already talked to you about this a little. The point that I want to make here is that you remember that there are these two groups, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Society, which was allied to the Liberal Party, and the Women's Social and Political Union, headed by the Pankhurst, that adopted a much more militant set of campaigns, disrupting meetings, attacking public property, and critically for 1909, going on hunger strike. At the heart of these tactics was an attempt to demonstrate that the authority of the liberal state depended upon the illiberal use of force and violence. Okay? So that the hunger strike, when women go on hunger strike, they are subjected to forcible feeding, which, as you see in this very grainy image here, okay, is headed the treatment of political prisoners under a liberal government. And forcible feeding of hunger striking suffragettes was often equated to the experience of rape. That this tube was forced down the throat of the striking suffragettes. It was so unpopular, the exposure of this government treatment, that in 1913 they try and withdraw from it by introducing the so-called Cat and Mouse Act, which would enable suffragettes, when they go on hunger strike, to be released from prison, to go home, to get their weight up, and then the idea was that they were going to be rearrested again and go and return to prison, where they would then go on hunger strike. The problem was that many of the suffragettes, when they were released from prison, they were very good at evading being rearrested, simply by moving around a lot and keeping under the radar. So that government reintroduces the use of forced feeding. Even by 1912, so horrified were the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies at the treatment of hunger striking suffragettes, and of the failure of the Liberal Party to develop to deliver on its promise of the right of women for the vote, that they switch their support to the Labour Party. Very big political moment. And true to my word, I'm going to do Ireland in 2 minutes. No one tell Professor Brady or Dungan, if any of you are in that class, that I'm doing this at rapid, quick time. Okay, so you remember Gladstone's introduction of Home Rule splits the Liberal Party in 1886. By 1893, the still just alive William Gladstone gets Home Rule through Parliament. This is the grand old man's great victory. But it's rejected by the House of Lords. Okay, same thing happens in 1912. Okay, so again, you have the Commons introducing Home Rule, and again the House of Lords rejecting the passage of the legislation. This, of course, does two things. One is it catalyzes the development of loyalists in Northern Ireland, in what became Northern Ireland, under the name of the Ulster Volunteer Force, founded in 1913, basically as a paramilitary organisation designed to ensure that the union with England, with Britain, was not broken. It also, of course, catalyses the nationalist movement, which had been going strong and indeed gathering pace throughout the 1870s and 1880s as well. The House of Lords finally passes Home Rule, but they do so in 1914, and the following month it's suspended because of the outbreak of the First World War. John Redmond, the leader of the nationalist movement in Ireland, commits to support the war effort, and he does so in the hope that showing Ireland support for Britain's effort during the war will mean that Home Rule will come back, that there will be the reward of Home Rule after the war. But for many people in the nationalist movement, that wasn't sufficient. And it was indeed a great cop-out. And that wing of the nationalist movement led the so-called Easter Rising in April 1916, when they took over control of the General Post Office in the centre of Dublin for a few days. There's about 1,800 people involved in the Easter Rising. 500 people end up dead, and the British government executes 15 of the leaders of the Rising in public, designed again, as after the revolt in India, as a piece of exemplary justice. Those people imprisoned as a consequence of the Rising some of them go on hunger strike. Okay, so hunger strikes is something that are moving from the women's suffrage movement now into the Irish nationalist movement. And very tragically, the first person who dies of a hunger strike in a British jail is Thomas Ashe in 1917. He's force-fed, and basically they fill up his lungs and not his stomach, and he dies. And he becomes, a hero. Indeed, all those martyred in the Easter Rising become very important symbolic figures for what was to become the Republican movement. And Thomas Ashe was one of those. Bearing in mind that I know you want just to get, the only reason that you've come is to get the midterm, I'm just going to rush through a conclusion, and then we can spend 5 minutes going through the prep sheet. The key point clearly that you have to make, that you have to get, is that what I'm talking about today is a whole series of political challenges to the nature of British liberalism. Not just to the Liberal Party, which was the Dangerfield story, but to the very philosophy or mentality of government that had liberalism with a small l had been based around since the 1830s and 1840s. And what I've tried to show is that a whole series of political movements, both at home and across the empire, sought to expose the fundamental contradictions of liberalism. Its promise of liberty and freedom, but its delivery of famine, its delivery of concentration camps, its delivery of the use of violence upon hunger-striking women. And therefore, liberalism is exposed not as being based around the rule of law and the spread of liberty, but around its very opposite. Now, the last point that I should make here is that there are many people who involved in these, and in a way Hobson is a good example of this, Nye Roger is a good example of this, some of the suffragettes are a good example of this. Many of these people were believed in free trade. They believed in the rule of law. They believed in the civilizing mission of the British Empire. What they were trying to do for some of these people was restore that as the possibility that the British Empire and Britain itself could be ruled by liberal principles. These people basically argued that those liberal principles weren't being effectively deployed. Now there were others like Renard, like the William Pierce and James Connolly in the Easter Rising, like Christabel Pankhurst, like the leaders of the Independent Labour Party and the Social Democratic Federation, who thought that those liberal principles had been fundamentally exposed as insufficient, and that a new type of mentality of government was required for the 20th century. And what I'll talk about on Thursday is the role that the First World War has in catalyzing that transformation. Any questions on that slightly frantic, very packed, deeply exciting lecture as we get these handed round? Anyone have a question? No questions? I don't think you're going to be taking the midterm, are you? Here. Give you those. Pass them down your row. Pass them down your row. Look at all the bad boys in the back here. Are you keeping them in check? I hope so. Right, so circulate.